Hello everybody and welcome back on Sunday. We're going to do chapter 24, Stacks and Piles. So as we had last week, they had a change of plans, and so tonight is the night of the concert, but they decided to skip the concert because they had both got dual marks and it had really just wiped them out. And so they woke up feeling better. They decided to head out to the fair and do another try at finding the fourth rune, although they were unsuccessful. But they ended up going back to the glass shop, and Henry at the glass shop, the word old-fashioned had kind of triggered him for them to go to kind of an antique store and go see if maybe they had some really old runes there. And so they get inside, and obviously they discover that this place is really neat, really interesting, and it is huge, like a labyrinth, like shop room after shop room after shop room. And so they have a token from Henry, and they need to find their special item, and then they can talk to Biddy, who's the shopkeeper, to see if he has the information they're looking for. So I'll just read a little bit of the last paragraph, and then that leads into this chapter. We were 2 more rooms over before I got my second hit. This time the object had a gentle glow of residual magic, and I could see right away it was just a small stone. It was flat, about the size of a dollar bill, and had a rune carved on the top. The stone was very old, and the lines of the rune were worn and faded. They were still discernible, though, and I could see this was an old-fashioned rune. The lines weren't straight. They had flow and direction for the magic. I had no idea what the rune did, but that was exactly what I was looking for. This was my interesting object. All right, now, Chapter 24, Stacks and Piles. The stone was inside a small drawer in a jewelry case, so I had GM take it out so everyone could see it. She was cautious about it, like it might jump up and bite her, but it was just a common stone. Sandy peered at it with interest, as she'd heard me talk about my healing rune before, but she'd never actually seen the difference for herself. MM put me back down again, as I didn't need to scan for the moment. It didn't seem like carrying me bothered him at all, but I didn't want to wear him out. I was skinny, but I wasn't that skinny. Sandy hollered for a shop friend, and we only had a brief wait before a steampunk coat rack wheeled into the room. "Greetings, esteemed patrons," the coat rack said in a surprisingly smooth voice. For some reason I thought it would sound digital or artificial, but instead it sounded like Tom Hanks. "Welcome to the Stacks and Piles, where treasures await those that find them. How may I be of service?" "Henry from the Spinning Tail has sent us, and we wish to speak with Biddy." Sandy was taking the lead, and I was perfectly fine with that. "It is rare that Biddy speaks with those from the outside," the coat rack said. "You may relay anything you wish to say to me, and it will be conveyed directly to him. Now, do you have a token from Henry to verify your statement?" "We do." Sandy gave it the glass coin. I hadn't noticed it before, but the shop friend had a little pouch on the side. "Thank you. The token has been accepted. Now, do you have an item of interest you wish to speak to Biddy about?" "We do," Sandy said again, and showed it the stone we'd found. "Interesting. I believe you found it in that drawer?" "That is correct." The coat rack fidgeted for a moment, but didn't say anything. I had a feeling it was sending that information somewhere else. It was interesting that the shop friend knew exactly where the rock had been. All the stuff in here was laid out in a haphazard kind of way. Surely the shop friends couldn't keep track of every single item here, could they? "Thank you for your patience. It is much appreciated. I don't believe that any of you have been to this realm before. Might I trouble you to yield to an identity scan? This only needs to happen once, and it helps us to provide you with the best and immediate service on this and all future visits." Sandy looked at us, and we nodded. I had a feeling this place was a lot more than just a shop and a fair. The sheer volume of goods and the size of the place was so much bigger than anywhere else we had visited. I was digging into old-fashioned charms, so it's probably a good idea to get in good with the place that had lots of old stuff. "That would be acceptable. as long as the scan causes no harm and the results of the scan are not shared with other parties. The scan will cause no harm, the coat rack said soothingly, and the information gathered will be used in this store only and not shared with any other clients. Now, with your permission, I will proceed. Sandy nodded and the coat rack looked at her intently. All the little gears that made up its eyes started spinning frantically. Then it blinked, smiled, and looked at me. I nodded also, and this time I got the intent look. I felt a gentle touch of magic. It was so light it almost tickled. I started to squirm a bit because, as Tyler knows, I'm very ticklish, but the scan ended quickly and I was okay again. The steampunk shop friend scanned MM and GM, and they didn't seem to feel a thing. What an interesting group of creatures you are, it mused. Now, if you would please introduce yourself and give me the name by which you would like to be called. Sandy went first, and we all gave our names. I thought it was interesting that MM and GM gave their full names, but they said they would like to be called by my nicknames. Once that was completed, the shop friend fidgeted again for a moment. The master has agreed to speak with you, it said, and I thought it sounded a bit surprised. Please follow me. It turned and wheeled off deeper into the labyrinth. We followed at an easy jog, and it felt nice to give my magic sight a break. I'd been slightly worried that Bermuda would start feeling restless and want to run around the store, but so far he seemed happy to just chill in his backpack. There were a lot of breakable things here, and we were a long way from the entrance, so I wasn't sure what I could do if he decided to make a fuss. I decided to just let that go and figure it out if it became a problem. I lost track of how many rooms we went through, but as we continued deeper, the rooms became less messy and much more organized. They also became more specialized. As an example, one room we went through was filled with old coins, but instead of just being piled on a table, they were all boxed in stasis cubes with tags that conveyed information about the age and type of the coin. There were also a lot more magical items, which gave me hope that Biddy would have what I was looking for. I think the most unusual thing we came across was a room as big as an airplane hangar, and it contained a wall. That's right, an old stone wall. It wasn't magical that I could see, and part of it had fallen over. I could only surmise that it was some sort of famous fortification from long ago. I kept an eye out in case we passed a room full of charms, but I didn't see anything like that. We'd been running for at least 20 minutes when the coat rack wheeled up to a wall and stopped. The wall looked just like all the other walls we'd seen, but I could only assume it was special as the shop friend knocked and then stood patiently. Nothing happened for a moment, and then the wall cracked in the center and the bottom half sank into the floor, leaving plenty of clearance for us to enter. Gesturing for us to precede him, the shop friend waved us through. We walked into a room, and these walls were made entirely of glass. There was so much to see, I wasn't sure what to look at first. The glass walls showed a picturesque view of what looked like the mountains of Colorado during the fall season. Colors of the autumn red, gold, and brown saturated the viewscape in a breathtaking way. Over the trees, the sky was dark with clouds, and a heavy drizzle of rain was falling. It made a pleasant pattering sound as it hit the dome ceiling above us, and streaks of water ran down the panes. The scene made me think of the crisp chill of the changing seasons, but the room didn't feel cool at all, with a roaring fire in a fireplace that was big enough for me to walk into. The floor was covered in thick, shaggy rugs, and the walls we had walked through had built-in shelves filled with books. The rest of the space was beautifully decorated with statues and art, and yet the whole thing struck me as a bit odd. Mixing a fireplace and glass? That was a recipe for disaster. Also, glass walls would sweat with temperature changes, so paper books should never be kept in an environment like that. Somehow the disparate parts of the room ignored the laws of physics and still managed to live in harmony. In the center of the room was the biggest recliner I'd ever seen in my life, and on that recliner, looking like a cat snuggled in a warm blanket, was a perfectly ordinary human being. If I'd have passed him on the street, I wouldn't have given him a second glance. In this place, though, it could only be Biddy, the person we were seeking. Please be seated. We were instructed by a new shop friend who was already in the room. The master will speak to you shortly. He is just finishing up a small project. This new shop friend was an upgrade to the one we've been following. It had 4 arms instead of 2, stood about a foot taller, and had a lot more gears. I could only guess that it was more of an assistant than something that helped with the shop. It gestured at the coat rack that led us here, which then settled into a resting position. Another gesture closed the door. I looked around and all the furniture in the room was made for comfort. Nothing looked formal or stiff. This was a room in which we could relax and spend a nice moment together. There was a plump red couch sitting opposite the huge recliner, so Sandy and I decided to sit on that. As soon as we did, the couch molded to our bodies, providing just the right amount of cushion and support. I put the backpack on the sofa between us. Beside the couch was a mess of thick pillows, and and GM trotted over and sank down on them with a happy sigh. We had just settled in and was starting to have a second look around when the man in the recliner waved his hand in the air like he was dismissing a bunch of screens. His recliner shifted so he's now sitting up more, and he gave us a happy smile. "Greetings and welcome." His voice sounded much bigger than I had expected. I apologize for the slight delay. I had an important piece of business that could not wait. The good news is now we should not be disturbed and can have a nice chat. He looked at his assistant. "Please serve our guests some of the new osmanthus tea we received the other day." He turned back to us. "It has a wonderful scent that reminds me of picked fruit when I was a boy. I would recommend adding a touch of honey. It comes from the same region as the osmanthus blooms, and together they really enhance each other's flavor." The assistant went to the side and returned almost immediately with a silver service cart containing a tea set. It served and GM first, making sure they sipped the tea, and added honey until they assured it the tea was just perfect. The teacups were so tiny, I wasn't sure how much actual tea they were going to get, but the aroma was certainly delightful. It was nice having a brief moment to watch the two of them enjoy something new together. wanted to travel to experience new things, and although he still was technically in-house ATAC, he was certainly having an adventure. Sipping tea with a mysterious man in a glass house was certainly different than working in a warehouse. Sandy and I were next, and the assistant had us sip the tea first to make sure it was to our liking. The brew was bitter, but the underlying floral and fruity notes were wonderful. Adding honey to it really kicked it up a notch. I like my tea sweet, so I told the assistant to just keep the honey flowing. It quickly hit the right balance, and I sat back with a sigh. Biddy was right. The osmanthus tea and the honey together was a taste of heaven. I looked up to see he was watching us with a smile on his face. I guess he got a kick out of watching his visitors have a bit of adventure too. I heard a whirring sound, and a small arm extended out the side of the sofa. The arm rotated, and the assistant put a saucer on its hand. I now had a place to rest my tea as we were talking. The whole rods and gears theme of this house was both useful and fun. I also noticed that even though I'd sipped my tea several times, it didn't look like it had anything less in my cup. I took a long sip, but the tea level and temperature stayed the same. That was just cool. "Now that we are all settled, we can begin," the man in the giant recliner said. "My name is Biddy, and I'm happy to meet with you today. It is very rare that I meet with guests that are so young and yet so intriguing. I'm a collector, as you can see from my shop, but I'm also an avid historian. I love to collect stories from people who have witnessed intriguing events firsthand. I find there is a sense of reality and truth that can only be gained from the original telling. As we all know, once a story is retold, it grows and changes to suit the themes of the day. I want to be upfront with you and let you know that the true payment I'm hoping to receive today are unique stories for my collection. I'm hoping that I have some. I'm also hoping that I have something of value for you. After all, a trade of desire leaves both heart. After all, a trade of desires leaves both parties much happier. Yes? We all nodded, and I felt relieved. I could tell a good story, and it didn't cost me any pearls. The rest of my crew perked up a bit at hearing this. They were really here for me, but if they could tell a story and go home with something of value, that would be really nice too. Excellent, Biddy continued. He looked at Sandy. Let's start with you, my dear. What are you up to right now? What would you like to improve on or get good at? What makes your heart sing and gets you up in the morning? Don't worry about a specific item or piece of information you want. Instead, go with the big themes for now. Sandy didn't have long to think. She already knew what she was up to. I'm the head of House Louisville, which is very small and very young at the moment, but I'd like to be a good leader, and I'd like the house and everyone in it to be successful. I know that sounds like a lot, but I had a wonderful mentor at House Chicago who taught me how to be a good mage and ask for nothing in return. I want to pass that on to others and create a house where supernaturals can grow and learn to be the best versions of themselves. Biddy nodded sagely. He was giving her his full attention. So what I'm hearing is, you want to establish a successful house, and you also want to be a supportive mentor. Is there anything else you'd like for yourself? An area of interest you would like to pursue? Well, Sandy said tentatively, I'm fascinated by charms. I love figuring them out, planning how to make new ones, and discovering new runes. I've had some success at making them, but I don't know that I will ever be one of the great charm makers. I just feel like I'm missing something, and I don't know what it is. It is just a hobby, and I put it aside more than once to focus on something important. But it just seems like it always comes back to charms. It just seems like I always come back to charms. She shrugged. I'm sure you have lots of charms you could show me, but I already have lots of things I still need to figure out. So I'm not sure adding more charms to collection is what I need right now. Biddy nodded sagely again. It sounds like you had the start of a true calling. I too dabbled in stories for a long time before I started taking it seriously. As a collector, I have a shop. I have things and stuff. I have something to point to say, this is my success. I've discovered I'm really a historian, though, and that doesn't give me anything that the rest of the world considers successful. There is nothing to point to that has value that others recognize. However, he paused. His eyes gleamed. I found that a good story can have much more of an impact on someone's life than any one thing ever could. You also may find your calling leads you to places and adventures you can't even imagine right now. Biddy took a sip of tea and turned to me. Now, young man, am I to understand you are the reason that everyone is here today? Yes, that is correct, I said simply. Then tell me what it is you are searching for. I'm searching for an old-fashioned force rune. I don't need one that is made up of straight lines and looks like stacked L's. I have access to those already. I would especially appreciate one that had a very quick and powerful force. I know you said to keep your request general, but that is what I need, and that is what brings me here to speak to you today. Biddy took another sip of his tea and regarded me thoughtfully. That is an incredibly specific request, and also a very odd one. It's odd because I've never been asked for an old-fashioned rune before. To most mages, a rune is just a rune. It has a form and a purpose. Also, most mages would ask for charms, not runes. Anyone will tell you that putting a charm together with its constraints, modifiers, and triggers is more important than the rune itself. I just know what I need, I said simply. Fair enough, he said. Is there anything else you would like? Something that is broader in scope, maybe? What did I want from him? I would have said to be able to protect my friends in my house and be safe, but I'd already had this safe conversation with Anna Lickett. This guy was a historian. If I was going to tell him a story, I wanted to hear one in return. I wanted something that he was uniquely qualified to give. I'd like to know the history of runes and charms, I said. Really? He exclaimed and sat up a bit more in his chair. I don't think that anyone has ever asked me for that before. I've had questions related to specific time periods, or someone has even asked about the history of a specific type of charm, but no one I can recall has ever asked about the far reaches of history. You are certainly an interesting young man. I just smiled and sipped my tea. Two people can play that game. Next, he turned to M.M. The same question for you. What are you wanting to achieve? I want to travel, M.M. said. I want to see new places and experience new things. And why do you want to travel? Biddy probed a bit. Do you want to get more powerful? Are you bored with your current life? Are you wanting to write a book and become a storyteller? M.M. thought about it seriously. You know, I've never really asked myself why before. I just knew it was something I wanted to do. I guess it's because the world is so big. There's so much life out there to see and experience. I just want more of it. Biddy nodded and turned to GM. And what do you want, my dear? I want my grandson to be safe, she said immediately. He sees the good in the world and wants to see all the wonder that it has to offer. The world also has a lot of pain and loss. A little bit of suffering is good for the soul, but I don't want him to truly experience the cruelty that is possible. Biddy sat back and thought for a moment. This is a unique situation for me. Usually the supernaturals that consult with me are much older and have a narrower focus. In your case, the world is so open for you. You are at the beginning of your journey, and what I find I want to do is to give you advice. My experience has been that nobody really listens to advice. On the other hand, I've heard your story so many times before. He gave a long sigh. I feel I can only try. Maybe something I say today will make a difference in your life. If it does, please come back and tell me the story of what I said and what changed. I love stories of living history, and that includes my own history too. All of your scans were interesting, and once I knew who you were, I was able to do some quick research into House Louisville. Now, here is what I propose. Sandy, I offer advice from someone who's heard the stories of many house heads. I have never been a head of house myself, but that gives me an even better perspective to tell you where they succeeded and where they failed. You will also greatly benefit, I think, from the history of runes. In exchange, I would like your honest impression of what it is like to be an ambassador of the deep earth. I've only been in the ambassador for less than a day, Sandy said. I'm afraid I won't have that much to tell you. Well, I'm only offering advice, he laughed, and most people ignore that. So I will take what you can tell me and be grateful. If you actually take my advice to heart, I would really love that too. Jason, I'm not a charm master, so I don't know exactly what you need, but the history of runes would also be very useful to you. I have a very old item that was used before charms. Once you hear the history, you will understand. It is too old and too valuable to give away, but I will let you examine the original and give you a copy to take with you. Hopefully that will work for whatever you have in mind. In exchange, I would like to hear the story of how you came to free the centaurs from their curse. I will tell you what I can, I said cautiously. You have to understand, I obviously didn't make the shrine or raise the memorial garden. I had to help the house, and there are things... I had the help of the house, and there were things I just can't say. I can give you my thoughts about what happened, and I can tell you what I saw, but sometimes my story will be light on details. If you are good with that, then we have a deal. I understand what you're referring to, he said. Yours will not be the first story I've heard that includes higher powers. That is acceptable to me. He looked at both of the centaurs. From what I understand from the scan, you both have recently just been through the shrine? They both nodded. I can only offer advice, so I would love to hear about your experience and anything else you can add to Jason's story. I know I'm focused on the shrine and breaking the curse, but this was a life-changing event for an entire sentient species, so as a historian, I just want to hear all about it. His eagerness shone through, and he seemed like a kid that was going to the candy store. I'm sure for a history buff, this had to be exciting stuff. MM and GM agreed to tell their stories, and now everything was set. Okay, Sandy, let's start with you. How does it feel to be an ambassador for the deep earth? Sandy started to say something, but Bermuda chose that moment to come out of his backpack and crawl into my lap. Biddy held up a hand and froze. Then he looked at his assistant. Why was I not informed there was a companion present? He snapped. Then he took a second look and his voice got louder. We have a celestial companion in our midst, and we have not offered him food or water. This is unacceptable. He clapped his hands and the assistant scurried back to the side of the room. Unacceptable. He seemed genuinely upset. Then it seemed like a whole army of little coat racks materialized, and soon the floor was filled with luxury stuff for Bermuda's ease and comfort. He had 3 types of litter boxes in case he wanted to go to the bathroom: fresh dirt, wood chips, and regular clay litter. He had a selection of liquids from cream to water to sauces. He had both crunchy foods and soft foods, blankets and pillows, and even a few boxes. Bermuda looked at me like, "See, Daddy, this is how I should be treated. This is the service to which I could become accustomed." Then he gave a big stretch, just to show he was the boss of all this activity, before he hopped down and started nosing around. I was pretty sure my lap had lost out to the boxes, but I didn't mind. As long as he was happy, I was happy. Now that Bermuda was settled, all the little coat racks vanished again, and Sandy began to tell her story. She skipped the whole oath binding her magic and John's together, as well as their marriage and honeymoon. Instead, she started with last night and how she heard the glass speaking to her. Getting the mark of the Lagarelle seemed to be the final piece the deep earth needed, and it initiated contact and struck a deal. She only briefly mentioned the fact that John was also an ambassador and that Annabeth and Tyler got the mark too. Then she spent a lot longer talking about her impressions and feelings as the deep earth took over and gave the mark to Seaful and myself. According to her, being possessed wasn't too bad, and it had been a fascinating experience seeing firsthand how the marks had come together. We all sipped our tea and enjoyed the tale. Biddy asked a few questions, but overall he seemed very happy with what he'd heard. Bermuda ate a few treats and ended up in a box that was too small for him. He had 3 of his legs sticking out as he wouldn't all fit, and he looked ridiculous. He also looked happy, so I let him be. Thank you for your story, Sandy, Biddy said. It has certainly been a pleasure listening to your experience with such a vast power. I will now attempt to give you some insight into what you will face in the future, and hopefully do it in such a way that it will save you lots of heartache and aggravation. He put his tea off to the side, cleared his throat, and gathered his thoughts. I looked over at Sandy, and she seemed open and eager to hear what he had to say. I think the biggest problem we have as human beings is recognizing when there is a transition. It seems like we're going along, doing what we always do and thinking everything is fine. Then, wham, a transition happens. We feel blindsided, upset, frustrated. How come we didn't see it coming? How come what we did is no longer working? Why do we have to change again? I would say this often happens to us because we aren't looking at our lives on a regular basis and looking for the next transition. If we don't see one right away, that's totally fine. A transition probably isn't coming immediately, but it is coming, and if we look routinely, we'll see it and react with a lot more grace and a lot less distress. In your case, Sandy, it's very clear that transitions are coming and probably when they will occur. You have 3 main goals: to be a good head of house, to be a good mentor figure, and to become a charms master. I would also add that you want to have a good relationship with this John fellow. Let's make that 4 goals then. Now, how many people are in your house at the moment? We have 4 people at the moment, Sandy said, and that includes me and John. Biddy nodded excitedly. That fits exactly. As part of my research, I found out the house itself made you the head. Is that correct? Sandy nodded. That makes perfect sense. You are a good all-around person for a small house. You can fight, you can lead, you're a mentor, you have the charms to back you up. So the things you're doing now to help your house and help your housemates win this fight you're having are probably just what you need to do. Biddy paused and his voice got a little ominous. What I can also tell you is that a transition is coming, and it's going to happen when you get more people added to your house. The first several new members will feel good. You'll have the time and attention to be a mentor, still run the house, and still experiment with your charms. Let's fast forward the scenario a bit and see the first transition. Let's say you have 100 new supernaturals join your house. Now you have too many supernaturals to mentor personally. If you don't transition to more of a leadership role, you're going to run yourself ragged. You'll be too busy to have time for John. You'll be too busy to have time for John, too busy to do a good job mentoring, and too busy to spend time with your charms. You'll have no support structure and no downtime. You'll collapse and burn out, and then you'll blame yourself for not being better somehow, for not doing it all. You'll become a bitter woman, and it will take you 100 years to recover and get some perspective. Sandy's eyes were big. This was not something she'd expected to hear. I could see this happening, though. Sandy is not the type of person to give up, so she would run herself ragged, trying to be the perfect mentor to all these new people. But, Biddy said loudly, interrupting his doom and gloom scenario, if you see the transition coming and you can feel out what is most important to you, you could put teachers in charge of the students so they still acquire the good base you wanted, but you won't be involved in the day-to-day training anymore. Or you could decide that being the head of your house is more important and just let the mentoring go for now. Or you could only mentor a small group and let the others learn however they can. Or you could decide you love mentoring and give up some of your responsibilities so you can keep mentoring. Do you see the difference? Biddy asked her. On one hand, you don't pay attention and run smack into the wall of life. On the other hand, you see the transition coming, and then you can choose how to deal with it. You either drive the camel or the camel runs over you. Now, just to drive the point home, let's go with the next transition. 1,000 people in your house. Now your house duties are getting out of hand. To put this in perspective, if each person in your house only had one issue a year they needed to talk to you about, that would still be over 3 issues a day that you needed to deal with. Given that, how are you going to handle your time with John? How are you going to get the time to tinker with your charms? How are you going to get any mentoring done? Certainly you can still be a house head and still be your own self, but it will take figuring out what you really want to do and letting go of the things that are less important to you. After all, you have to be true to yourself before you can be a blessing to those around you. Biddy stopped and took a long sip of his tea. Sandy sat there with a very thoughtful look on her face. What he'd said made perfect sense to me. Sandy hadn't been looking out for her life transitions, and they would have smacked her right over the head. It also made me think about my own goals as a mage. I'd just been doing the best I could with what I had. We were at war, and the simple goal right now was to survive and get stronger. Once I figured it all out, though, I'd probably be faced with my first life transition as a mage. What did I really want to do? I didn't really have a good answer. Now, Biddy said, turning to the 2 centaurs, let's talk about the shrine and your wonderful experience there. When I did a scan, your magic looked almost nothing like a regular new natural. On one hand, your magic is very fresh. On the other hand, it's so settled and smooth. It's like you're both only a few days old, and you've been a powerful natural for over 20 years. No wonder you were able to manipulate the glass so well. I can't wait to see all the wonderful things this new group of supernatural centaurs get up to. It was interesting to hear Biddy's impression of their magic. I had no idea what a new supernatural should feel like, but I had a hunch there was something special about these centaurs that had gone through the shrine. The all rune doesn't do anything by half measures. GM went first, and she started with getting healed and spending the night out in the memorial meadow. Biddy had a very confused look on his face at this point, as this wasn't anything he'd expected, but he let her keep talking, and soon it sort of made sense. GM was very much in touch with how wonderful life was for her right now, and it showed through in everything she said. I loved listening to her tale, and I think Biddy did too. MM had actually been there the first night, so he started his tale with the room expanding and the memorial lights growing out in the garden, or in the ground, out of the ground. Whew. He covered the shrine building itself and how it felt like to go inside and be transformed. He had a practiced ease to his story, as I'm sure he'd already told it a lot. He'd already been through a lot of interviews after all, and this was just one more interview for him. You both gave me more than I expected. Biddy sounded very happy. So thank you for that. It was great to have a first-hand account of how the memorial garden and the shrine formed. I thought only Jason would have that information. I am in your debt. So once you grow a bit, you are welcome to come back here again, and I'll see if I have anything else to help you on your journey. Both MM and GM were surprised, but thought that sounded good. They hadn't started their training at all, so they had no idea how they were going to develop. Now, let's cover my advice to you, MM. Again, I hope you find this useful and take it to heart. The search for adventure is also part of the human condition. I know you are only half human, but I've heard stories from more adventurers than I can count. After listening to enough of them, I've started to discover a few key points. First, adventuring is a state of mind. If you are open to adventure, then adventure will find you wherever you are. You don't need to go to a completely different place to have new experiences. Chefs find adventure in the kitchen with everything they bake. Warriors find adventure with every practice swing of their sword. Teachers find adventure with every interaction with their students. For you, your life has now changed. You are natural. You will be traveling and training and experience all sorts of new things. I think what you really need to learn is what to do with the adventures once you've found it. Biddy paused to let that sink in. MM looked surprised. I think his end goal had been doing something other than a warehouse job. He probably never thought how to handle all the new stuff headed his way. For that matter, this was really interesting for me too. My life had been nothing but adventure since I'd become a supernatural. I'd been taking it as it came, but the adventure was going to continue, so learning how to be a good adventurer would be very useful. The first thing a successful adventurer needs to learn is how to create a routine. MM and I looked at each other in surprise. Do what? I know that sounds like a paradox, but we must have consistent things in our life in order to stay regulated. It's like a heartbeat. Lots of things happen in our lives between one beat and the next, but the beat of our heart keeps us grounded. I've talked to adventurers that just went wild and experienced new thing after new thing without grounding themselves at all. They all have gone crazy in one form or another. However, adventurers that create a routine stay grounded, and they can find that perfect spot of happiness between the new and the familiar. Some examples of this can be going to sleep at the same time each night, or waking up at the same time each morning. A morning routine where you eat the same foods and watch the same shows keeps you grounded. For warriors, doing the same basic training routine before starting new techniques is best. For chefs, it might be laying out their kitchen or sharpening their knives before they start cooking. The very best thing, however, for staying grounded is your personal connections. You have your grandmother with you, and that is more of a blessing than you can know. As you experience new things, tell them to her. Unwrap your feelings with her, and let her be your North Star. She may be happy, sad, or mad for you, and that is all okay, but it tells you what direction you're headed. You will have supernatural friends and enemies on your journey. Treasure them. They will keep you sane and remind you of who you are. Always share your experiences and adventures with others if possible. As you look back, you'll notice you remember who you were with more than who you were with and the good times you had together rather than what actually happened. Let's take tonight for example. You are still in the same house you've always been in, but now you are having tea in a totally new place. You're hearing stories you haven't heard before, and you'll go home tonight and sleep in your familiar bed, therefore having both an adventure and a grounding moment. Best of all, you're sharing this experience, so it bonds you and connects you to everyone in this room. In a few days, look back at this night. I think you will find this was the perfect adventure for you. And now that you know the rules, you can create adventures like this anytime you want. Biddy looked at MM intently. It looked like he was trying to magically implant his experience into MM's brain. I think MM got it though. He was thoughtful and excited, like his world was opening up before him. I know I was excited to learn from Biddy's experience too. I'd realized I had a lot of grounding in my adventures. I'd had the same apartment the whole time, so there had been a nice normal space to be in. It had changed, sure, but it was still my apartment. Tyler, Sandy, Annabeth, and John had all become new friends, and they had all grounded me for sure. When I'd been recovering from my waker moment, they had sat beside me and made sure I was getting better. When I'd been punched by the golem, they had sat beside me again to make sure I was going to be okay. I'd returned the favor with Sandy, John, and Annabeth after our big fight with Isabel. We'd grounded each other, and as a team, we'd come out stronger. That concludes my advice. I hope you profit from it and return to tell me of all the wonderful things you've experienced. GM, you wish for MM to be safe in his travels. I don't have anything specific I can give you for that. Both of you will need to grow and become stronger. That is the only way to keep yourselves safe. To that end, I do have some unique advice I can give you as an historian, and that is, he paused dramatically, the training they have for naturals right now is shit. Absolute shit. Again, we all looked at each other in surprise. The current naturals training is based on two things: physical attributes and special ability. Training physically, of course, is important. Becoming faster and stronger is a no-brainer, and it's certainly something you should do. Almost all naturals have some sort of special ability, so training that is also a no-brainer. However, that usually doesn't appear until you are much older, and according to the old stories, naturals could do so much more. Right now, you will be training like low-grade mages, but naturals used to be powerful supernaturals in their own right. They could fly, heal very quickly, move at astonishing speeds, and cover great distances. They could see the invisible, become invisible themselves, speak with the voice of angels, and communicate over great distances. Naturals used to be absolute badasses. I don't know exactly how they trained long ago, as they kept their secrets then, just like we do now. I can tell you they were strongest during what I term the era of the rune. We are now in the era of the charm, and naturals have become weaker than they've ever been. I'm telling you this because if you can figure out what they did before, you could become one of the most powerful naturals of this current age. That was very interesting. Since I was a god, I was both a mage and a natural, although a weaker version of either one on their own. So anything that made a natural stronger was something that would benefit me as well. Biddy was still talking, and I didn't want to miss anything, so I put my introspection to the aside for a moment. He was now looking at me. And this is the perfect segue into our main story of the evening, the history of runes. Sandy, I'm hoping this will inspire you to delve deeper into your charms and maybe develop your skills in a different direction. MM and GM, I'm hoping that learning a bit more about naturals at the peak of their power will inspire you to grow beyond what you are told is possible. Jason, I'm not entirely sure what you're up to, but this is part of what you requested for your story. After this, we'll hear your tale, and then we conclude our evening. Now listen carefully as I tell you the true tale of how runes began. And that ends chapter 24. Chapter 25, we are going to get into some good history. All right, see you guys next week.